Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and sorry to interrupt the great discussions that are going on, but welcome to the first event of 2015 with the Calgary Chamber. Hope you all had a great holiday break and have come back recharged to hear just how low oil is going to go. So we can begin the economist jokes, and as a recovering economist, I have been the butt of them many times. And so you can start saying things like, why do they bury economists 10 feet down instead of 5 feet down? Well, because deep down, they're really not that bad. Or how do you tell the extroverted economists in the group, they're looking at your shoes? I know, I didn't write these, folks. They're just out there in the Ethernet. But we're very excited to have the chief economist of BDC and the chief economist for ATB to give us their perspective on what 2015 looks like. And interestingly, this event was going to be happening back in October, but we couldn't find schedule alignment between all parties. And in fact, I think fate was a little bit on our side, because I think it's more appropriate and more interesting and more timely today than it would have been back in October, because economists, we can all get together 1 year later and figure out how wrong we were, but we would have been probably really wrong back in October versus only sort of wrong today. But we're delighted that you've joined us. Hope you find some insight and something you can take away to support your business over the year, help make some better decisions. We're going to have both of our speakers give a presentation, and then we're going to have the little fireside chat here, armchair chat, and you'll get a chance to pose some questions to our two economist speakers a little later on. So events like this couldn't happen without the support of our wonderful sponsors, and our sponsors for today are ATB, BDC, and TELUS, and so thank you very much to those three organizations for making today's event possible. And as you know, we have Todd Hirsch, who is the Chief Economist with ATB Financial, and Pierre Clereau, Vice President of Research and Chief Economist with BDC, both presenting today. As I mentioned, they'll give a brief set of opening remarks, and then we'll have an armchair conversation a little bit later. You'll notice some cards on your table, so please do jot down any questions you may have for each of our speakers. And around the armchair chat time, just hold them up, and a member of the Chamber staff will come around, collect them, and we'll pose them to them. Hopefully we'll have time for all our questions. It's my pleasure to introduce our head table today. Our two speakers, Todd Hirsch, Chief Economist at ATB, and Pierre Clereau, Vice President, Research and Chief Economist with BDC. We also have Laura Diddick, Vice President of Finance and Consulting with BDC. Lorenzo DeSico, Vice President with TELUS Business Solutions and Calgary Chamber Board Member. Dax Nobriga, Branch Manager of ATB Stephen Avenue Location. And Rob Hawley, Partner with PricewaterhouseCoopers and Chamber Board Chair, newly installed this year. So ladies and gentlemen, our head table. Also like to welcome another one of our board members, Phil Roberts, who's the Business Development Director of Marketing with Vintry Technologies. Thank you, Phil, for joining us today. So a few other quick announcements on events. On January 20th, we'll have another Fast Growth Champion event taking place. This one focused on brands we love. So all those kinds of stories about all those companies that are great, things like Crave Cupcakes and Fashions at SB Experience and Coco Chocolatiers, all those kinds of companies are household names in our city. Join us at National on 8th Avenue for an after-work beer and some good insights on brands that have been developed into household names. And on February 4th, we're welcoming and installing Rob Hawley, our new board chair for the Calgary Chamber. And we're also having a keynote address by Robert Johnson, who's CEO of the Eurasia Group, for his views on the global perspective of energy markets and geopolitics. So go to calgarychamber.com for those and many other events. So a few other housekeeping things that ask you to turn your cell phones to silent or vibrate, but you can follow the conversation or add to the conversation digitally on Twitter. Our handle is @CalgaryChamber. And with that, we have Todd Hirsch, who is the Chief Economist with ATB Financial.
Thank you to Adam and the Chamber for inviting me to be part of this exciting day. It's actually quite daring to start off the new year with two economists, actually, to sort of kick things off. I think on balance, the news these days is quite interesting. I think that there are some, maybe some dangerous spots or dangerous things to think about with Alberta's economy. But the title of my presentation, Who Should Worry and Who Shouldn't? An Alberta Economic Forecast for 2015. The wisdom of Charlie Brown is we can learn a lot about the secret of economics from the secret of life, which is to replace one worry with another. I think this is actually a lot of what the profession of economists do. A year ago, had I been standing at this podium, I would have been saying, we've got some worries in Alberta's economy. Costs for oil producers are skyrocketing and they can't be profitable, and labor shortages are crushing, and temporary foreign workers. Well, fast forward to January 2015, and we've replaced all those worries with a whole new set of worries. So I guess economists were doing our job with replacing one worry with another. I get asked this a lot. What are you anxious about? Is there anxiety? Should we be worrying? Should we be panicking? Is now the time to panic, Todd? I don't know how many times a day I get asked this question, and in some ways it's sort of a silly question if we should panic. I mean, there's never a time or a reason to panic, but maybe should we worry? And what should we worry about? Well, by nature, I'm not much of a worrier. So what I've had to do is put some Post-it notes around my home to remind me, oh yeah, worry about this, worry about that, because people seem to think I should be worried. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is take you through some of those worry Post-it notes, put up around my home, and I'll talk a little bit about what's some of the worrying spots around the global and national economy. And then we'll turn back to Alberta and talk about what's happening here. My first worry note, well, you don't have to worry too hard if you want to look for things to worry about. You don't have to look too much further than our friends in Russia right now. A lot of trouble, not just geopolitical trouble with the aggressions in Crimea and Ukraine, but also more economic and financial trouble. Now, what happens when a currency the size of the Russian ruble gets cut in half very quickly like that, and the economic and financial instability that can come from that, I think there are some reasons that in 2015 we haven't seen the end of the Russian drama playing out, where there could in fact be some ripple effects around the global economy stemming from the turmoil in Russia. Just next door in Europe, there are other reasons for worry. And back in the spotlight once again is our little friend Greece. Just when you thought it had sort of quietly gone away and got on with its business, now Greece is, sort of in the throes of another round of elections. The first round of election in December, not decisive, so they're having another one at end of January. And this could, in fact, be a very pivotal election for Europe, because in the lead in the Greek run-up to their election is a party that is basically avowed to snub its nose at the austerity measures that the European Union has required, and in fact has made overtures of saying that we're going to pull Greece out of the European Union. Now, all of that is yet to be seen. However, I think there could be some destabilizing fears coming out of Greece and coming out of Europe in the coming months. And of course, although we don't trade a whole lot with Europe, what happens in European financial markets can very easily have destabilizing ripple effects around the global economy. So I think Europe might be another point of worry in 2015. Should we worry about China? Now the world's second largest economy, its economy growth having slowed quite dramatically from where it was growing several years ago, but growth of around 6 or 7, maybe 8%, hard to say with certainty. But a cynic or a pessimist doesn't have to peel back too many layers to worry about imbalances growing within the Chinese economy as well. Rigidities in its banking system and financial system, and also are the developers over-leveraged, and has there been far too much developing. There are obviously some reasons for some concern looking forward in China. However, I'm not convinced that of all the things to worry about in 2015 in the global economy, I don't think China will be the biggest worry. I think what's happening in Russia and Europe are probably taking a little bit a bigger role in the worry category. Should we worry about Canadian household debt? This is another topic that comes up almost every time I give a presentation. And of course, the Bank of Canada has been quite repetitive in its, saying household debt in Canada is reaching bad levels and everyone's got to pull in. I would say I'm concerned about it. I'm not worried about it. Again, because maybe I don't worry naturally about too many things. There are some concerns, however, when you are seeing record levels of debt to income in Canada, and particularly here in Alberta as we move into some slowdown. I think there's no question there may be some households that find themselves in a not good place with how much debt they've taken on. But what makes me not feel too worried or panicked about this at the moment is the fact that borrowing costs remain very low. I'll talk about interest rates in just a moment. But I think that there is going to be still some time available to people and households who have amassed far too much debt to get their debt household in order. Should we worry about the loonie? Well, here's where I love economists, because 2 years ago, when the loonie was trading above $1 US, the economists were all saying, oh, this is terrible news, our exporters were not competitive, and this is just awful for central Canada, and what can we do? And now, with the Canadian dollar at 83 or 84 cents to the US dollar, economists are saying, oh, this is terrible news, and it's so difficult for importers, and we're going to see inflation pressures waning and all this kind of stuff. Well, you can't really have it both ways. There is a good news and a bad news story anytime the currency moves. But I would actually argue right now, with the Canadian dollar trading at about 83, 84 cents to the US dollar, or I guess 83 US dollars cents to buy a Canadian dollar, actually that's probably good news for the Canadian economy right now. What I would not want to see is the Canadian dollar in free fall, Russian ruble style, and I don't think that is what we're experiencing at all. I think the Canadian dollar has softened sort of in sympathy with commodity prices, particularly crude oil. But really, this still remains more of a US dollar story than a Canadian dollar story. In fact, the Canadian dollar, while it's lower, has not fallen by nearly as much as other global currencies against the US dollar. This is typically what happens when there is insecurity and fear in the global economy. Investors run and duck for cover in US dollar treasuries, and you're seeing that again. So it's pushing some strength in the US dollar. The Canadian dollar softening. I think in 2015 we haven't seen the end of softening. I think it could reach 80 or maybe even 78 cents US to the Canadian dollar before it's finished. But I don't think actually on balance that is such a bad thing. Makes it difficult for importers, absolutely. For those vacationers who want to enjoy their holidays in Arizona or Hawaii, there is going to be some costs there. But on balance, the softer Canadian dollar is just the nice tonic right now that central Canada certainly needs, and indeed our resource exporters here in Western Canada. Should we worry about interest rates? Well, I think this is one area, depending on how you look at it, if you like higher interest rates or not, if you're a borrower or a saver. But I don't think we will see much movement on interest rates in 2015. My guess is the Bank of Canada will remain on hold until probably the end of the year and maybe even into early 2016. As the Canadian economy is cooling off a little bit, sort of because of what's happening here in Western Canada, there is no inflationary pressures really building at all. There were some inflation pressures building, it looked like in end of October, November, end of last year. But I think with gasoline prices and other energy prices related to oil, I think inflation pressures will actually wane again. And I don't think the Bank of Canada will find much motivating reason to increase rates in 2015. I think we're still a ways away. So I'm not too concerned yet about raising interest rates. I think we are in for another extended period of low, favorable borrowing rates. So then that brings us to Alberta. What is going on in this province, and should we worry? Who should worry and who shouldn't worry? Well, of course, everyone knows it's the topic on everybody's mind over the last several months. It's all about this here, crude oil, and the fact that these oil prices, the West Texas price, has been chopped now by more than half since reaching that sort of recent peak in June of 2014. These days, with oil hovering in the mid kind of $40 range, 45, 46, I'm not sure what it's trading at the moment. Who knows, it might be changing even as we speak. But there is obviously a lot of interest, a lot of concern, and in fact, there is a lot of worry. What does this mean now for Alberta's economy? We know that we are very dependent on resources, and with natural gas not having been a very significant driver over the last several years, crude oil has been sort of the one dog that wags an awful lot of tails. So going into 2015, with oil prices in this environment, where does it leave this province? Well, I don't think there is any way to sugarcoat it. It is going to be a soft year for Alberta's economy. There are other forecasters. There's a range of forecasts out there. One of them that's attracting a lot of attention, the Conference Board, is predicting now an outright recession for Alberta's economy. And I've been asked a lot in the last 24 hours, how can you explain that I'm not expecting a recession? We're expecting growth of about 2%, whereas the Conference Board is saying a recession. But if you look at it, we're actually not really that far off. We're more or less on the same page. What we're saying is growth is going to slow dramatically in this province. If it's an outright contraction or not, or if it's just very weak growth, we'll have to wait and see. By the middle of this year, we'll probably have a better idea. But the point is, most economists, in fact, all economists are on the same page with saying it is going to be a slow year. And even with growth at 2%, it may actually feel a bit recessionary. I think where we may feel it most immediately is in the job market, particularly for new graduates who are going to be looking for employment after they come out of school, or that summer job market. I think 2015 is going to be a very challenging year for recent grads. And that is something I wish I didn't have to worry about or have to talk about, because it isn't any fun when you're trying to find some work experience, but you're getting nothing but thank you letters, thank you for your application. But I think it will be a challenging year for not only recent graduates, but actually the job market in general. I do expect the unemployment rate in Alberta to rise, especially over the first half of 2015. Now, I went back and looked at a little chart of unemployment rates in Alberta over the last 40 years, and there's very, very familiar and kind of repetitive cycles here. The unemployment rate tends to skyrocket very quickly in recession or even in slowdown years, and then it takes a while for it to come down. So it's often marked by this kind of surging rate of unemployment at the beginning. I think between now and late spring, early summer, we will see a surging unemployment rate. We haven't seen it so far. Oddly, December's numbers, even though oil was weak already in December, but employers so far seem to be holding on as well as they can, but I do think at some point we will start to see more pink slips flying. And that is unpleasant. There's no way around it. To be unemployed or to receive a notice that your job is ending, it isn't a pleasant situation at all. Where I would offer perhaps some comfort or some words of, don't worry about this too much, is that this is a very familiar cycle. Alberta is known to have rebounded quite quickly sometimes from these downturns. The question is, how long will these oil prices stay where they're at? My guess is, and it is only a guess, in our forecast that we released last week, we outlined sort of 3 case scenarios. And the most likely case scenario in my mind is that we see these oil prices probably not having reached a bottom yet as of Tuesday, but these oil prices are going to bump around at some pretty low levels for the first half of the year before they stabilize and then start returning to something closer to what an economist would say would be an equilibrium price, maybe around $70 or $75 by the end of the year. However, that does leave a pretty weak price environment on average for 2015. One of the benefits of it, however, is we will start to see costs come down. And that, a year ago I would have been saying cost escalation is the big problem. Well, in 2015, we are going to see those costs ratchet down. Sometimes they're a little bit slow in doing that. But we will see a bit of rebalancing brought back into the energy sector. Because everyone in this room is certainly old enough to remember, it hasn't been that long ago where, $75 oil, even $50 oil, was actually a really good price. But in the meantime, costs have escalated for producers, so we're going to see a little bit of unwinding of that cost, a little bit of rebalancing, and that will actually be beneficial to the industry in the long run. There are some sectors that actually will benefit tremendously in 2015. This is where I'm the glass is half full kind of guy. Our second, third, and fourth largest industries in Alberta: forestry, agriculture, and tourism. Now, admittedly, combined, these 3 industries are a shadow of what the energy sector is. So, we have to recognize that. But when you do see other industries not sort of beholden to what happens with the price of oil, I think they will do very well with low fuel prices, a low Canadian dollar, and a U.S. economy that is more or less back on its feet. So I think there are some offsetting factors here as well. I love this quote here: "My life has been full of terrible misfortunes, most of which never happened." There is a danger in Alberta right now that we tend to focus a little bit too much on the negative. And I don't want to sugarcoat this. There isn't, as I said, there's no way to kind of soft sell this. It is going to be a difficult, challenging year for Alberta. But I think by the end of 2015, we'll look back at the beginning of the year and say, actually, that was rough, but things are now starting to improve. A lot of those worst case scenarios that we thought were upon us actually never transpired at all. So, to get back to that original question then as I wrap up, who should worry and who shouldn't worry? Well, this guy here should worry. He's in a mess of trouble if this shark gets hungry. People on this train should worry. I don't really know how this happens, but either the front or the end of this train seems to be in real bad shape, so they might want to say some prayers. And this little dog has a lot to worry about. Aside from that, though, I would really encourage Albertans not to worry about this too much. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting this isn't going to be a little bit painful, but worry really doesn't get us anywhere. And I want to leave on this little sign here, please do not feed the fears. The biggest threat to Alberta's economy in 2015 actually isn't $45 oil, it's actually fear. Because what happens when fear takes root in people and in companies is that they start to make irrational decisions. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't make prudent decisions and sensible decisions, absolutely. Even when oil's at $107 a barrel, we should make prudent decisions. Sometimes there's not enough of that happening. So we should always be prudent, but we shouldn't be fearful and worrisome because that leads to irrational decisions, and that actually poses a bigger threat to Alberta's economy in 2015 than low oil prices. So with that, I will turn it over to our next speaker, and I look very forward to the question and answer time afterwards. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Pierre Cleroux.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you to the Chamber for your invitation. I'm very happy to be here today. I'm also very happy to be with Todd. Last time we were on the same podium was in Lethbridge, Alberta, about a year ago. And it's very interesting because we didn't talk to each other before, but I'm going to take quite a different route than Todd. Todd has worries, and I think it's a good time to have some worries. I'm going to present a different perspective. Where are the good news actually in the global economy, and what does it mean for you as a business people? Actually, there was a lot of jokes about economists before the presentation. And one of the jokes that we didn't mention is when you put 5 economists in the same room and you ask them a question, you will get 5 different answers. And more often, they will see very different and they will be contrary. But actually, I quite agree with the evaluation of Todd about the Alberta economy, where the Alberta economy is going to end up this year. I don't believe there's going to be a recession. I agree with Todd, there's going to be a slowdown in the investment, which will limit the growth of the economy this year in Alberta. But I think we'll still see some growth in the economy. And of course, the price of oil is going to bounce back, and this is going to have a positive impact on the economy of Alberta. But more than oil, there's also another side of the economy that I'm going to talk about today. So what I would like to do is to present you a different perspective, a perspective of how the world economy is finally growing after a long recession. I know in Canada and Alberta, we haven't experienced a very severe recession since 2007, 2008. But in some part of the world, in Europe, for example, they have been struggling to get out of this recession. So finally, we see the global economy improving, especially in the US. And I'm going to talk about what does it mean as opportunities for you as business. So first, I'm going to talk about the region in the world that are going to experience the strongest economic growth in 2015. Second, I'm going to talk about export as a strategy for growth. And I believe that this is the great timing to explore other markets outside Alberta and outside Canada. And finally, I'm going to talk about a strategy that small business can use to be successful at exporting. So first, the world economy. Actually, like I said, the world economy is finally improving. And we believe in 2015, the GDP, the world GDP is actually going to be better than over the last few years. mostly supported this time by developed economies. Over the last 5 years, emerging countries have been experiencing better growth than developed economies. When I talk about developed economies, I talk about Canada, the US, Europe. But finally, the next few years are going to be the year of developed economies. The US economy, and I'm going to talk about that a bit later, is going to be the main driver of the world economy, and we should see in the next 2 or 3 years an improvement. So if we look at the developed economies, those 3 countries are going to experience the highest economic growth in 2015. First, the US. The US had a pretty good growth last year, but is going to grow by more than 3% this year. The reason why we're so optimistic about the US is because the consumer are back. First, there's more people working today in the US than before the last recession. So they have regained all the job lost during the recession. Last month in December, the economy has created more than 350,000 jobs in the US. That's a huge amount, even for the size of the US economy. In average, the US economy is creating about 200,000 jobs. So consumers are more and more Americans are working. The second reason, which is also important, is the debt ratio of consumer in the US has really been declining over the last 5 years. So not only there's more people working, but it's also they are better positioned to buy or to borrow money, and they do. The car sales over the last few months have been a record high. The housing market is coming back. So the US economy is going to grow rapidly this year and probably over the next few years, driven by the consumer demand, which is a good news because a lot of Canadian businesses are involved or selling to the consumer market in the US. Other countries that are going to do well, Todd said that Europe is struggling, and it's true. It's getting out of the recession, is improving, but it's going to be slow. But one of the countries which is part of Europe somehow is the United Kingdom, who is really having a great time in terms of the economy. And the growth is going to be almost 3% this year. Finally, Korea, on the Asian side, is going to be the strongest economic growth for developed economies. And I'm going to come back on Korea a little bit later. In terms of emerging countries, we have also very good news. Some of the emerging countries are doing very well. Mexico is a great example. They have built over the last decade a strong industrial base. You know that the automotive sector now in Mexico is as big as the Canadian one. They are doing very well, and their growth is going to be significant this year. In terms of Asia, there's a lot of worry about China, but China is going to grow by about 7%, which is still very significant for the second largest economy in the world. And also what is important in Asia is the creation of this new middle class that are buying more and more our products. Indonesia and India is also going to experience a very good year. So as the world economy is improving, and we believe this is not only for this year, but this is going to be sustained for a few years, this is a great timing to think about our strategy for growth. And export is one of the best strategies for growing our business. I will give you 3 reasons why, as a business, you should look at exporting. The first one is because our aging population in Canada, our growth in Canada is going to be limited in the next few years. Over the last 2 decades, economic growth in Canada has been averaging 2.6%. The Bank of Canada believes that the average over the next decade is going to be around 2%. Our aging population, the fact that our labor force is aging, this is going to limit our growth. So as our growth is limited, we have to look to new markets to grow our business. The second reason is when we look at high growth firms in Canada, we can see that the most successful one, the businesses who are growing the most in Canada are the ones who are exporting. And finally, BDC research just last November, we look at the most successful firm in Canada. We look at their specific strategies, what make the difference to be a very successful firm. And by the way, there was a lot of firms from Alberta in our most successful firm in Canada, and they are exporting more than other businesses. 26% of the most successful firm in Canada are exporting compared to only 14% for other businesses. So export is a great strategy to grow our business, and the timing is right as the world economy is growing. And this is also the case for business in Alberta. We talk a lot about oil, and I'm sure in the discussion after those two presentations we'll talk about oil, but there's another economy in Alberta as well. The graph that you see is the part of export for all the sectors in Alberta outside the energy sector. And you can see that the chemical industry, the farming products, machinery equipment, for example, meat products are representing strong subsector of the manufacturing sector, which are important for export. And last year, these sectors did very well. Last year, Alberta export increased by 18% around the world, by 20% to the US. And here you see the sectors who did the best. For example, meat product increased by almost 50% last year alone. Export of meat product has increased by almost 50%. Important sector like chemical increased by more than 10%. So these Alberta businesses are benefiting from the growth in the US and also in the rest of the world. Because if the US is the #1 trade partner for Alberta, more and more Alberta businesses are exporting around the world. Over the last 10 years, Alberta export has increased by more than 10% to Russia, which, like Todd said, this is not probably going to be the case this year because the Russian economy, I agree, is going to slow down. But when you look at diversification, more and more Alberta businesses are selling outside the US. They are selling all over the world. And that's the case, obviously, in Asia. So when we combine the economic growth of the countries that are going to grow the most, and also the past experience of Alberta businesses, when we combine the two, we are able to identify 3 key markets that you should look at as a strategy for exporting in 2015. The first one is not a surprise, I'm sorry not to surprise you, is the US. The reason why we believe it's not only because the US is going to grow rapidly, and this is our #1 trade partner, but a lot of Canadian businesses have went away of the US over the last 5 years. The US has a very severe recession, and it was difficult to do business or to sell our products and services over the last 5 years. But things are changing and last year was a very good year for our export to the US, and 2015 is going to be even a better year. So the US has to remain a key market for our strategy. You have to remember the US is still the #1 economy in the world. It's over 20% of the world economy. So that's very significant. The second market, this is maybe a surprise, China. I know there's a lot of concern about China, but China is still growing very rapidly. And what we have to understand of Westerners is China operates a different way than our economy. This is a very organized, very structured economy where the government plays an incredible role to find the right balance. So even if they have challenges, a lot of economists are confident that China will continue to grow. And the second reason why this is a key market is because it's emerging a new middle class. More and more people in China has enough money to buy high quality goods, and this kind of product that we produce in Canada. For example, our sale for food in China has really increased significantly over the last few years. We sell, for example, more and more beef from Alberta in China. We sell more seafood from BC and from the Atlantic provinces to China. We sell more and more products in different manufacturing sectors to China. Finally, the third country that is a key market for us is South Korea. Not only because this 50 million people country is growing rapidly, but also because Canada has just signed a new free trade agreement with South Korea. This free trade agreement is going to change the game. It's going to eliminate 95% of tariff on Canadian products exported to South Korea. It's also going to reduce a lot of the red tape because Canadian companies will be able to use their Canadian certification to export their product to South Korea. So this is a great timing to look to export into this country. We already have a lot of Canadian companies who have success in South Korea. For example, from Alberta, we sell a lot of meat, especially beef, to South Korea. Canada Goose, maybe that you know, sell winter coats to South Korea. Bombardier sell planes and trains to South Korea. So a lot of Canadian companies are already there, but this new free trade agreement opened the door to this developed economy in Asia. So if you are an owner of a smaller business, you might worry that exporting is a good idea, but this is mostly for large and mid-sized firms. A lot of people believe that I'm too small to export. So the last few slides of my presentation, I want to give you a different perspective about this, because more and more small business are able to export with the new technology. Let me explain why. 41% of Canadians now are buying online. Even more businesses are buying online today. Almost 50% of Canadian businesses are buying online today. And this is the case all over the world. All over the world, people, consumers, businesses are buying online. The digital technology is actually changing the game for small business. You can have access now to billions of consumers with online technology with very low cost, which was not possible 10 years ago. And let me give you three examples. The first one is a company from Calgary called Sealwell Corporation. They are selling sealers for the pipeline industry all over the world. This company was built in Calgary in 1969, and they created a product for the local market. Now they are selling in 90 different countries around the world. And they use their website to market their product, to provide technical information to their potential consumer all over the world. The web technology allowed them at very low cost to be visible, to market their product in different parts of the world. This is how a small business can use the web, this new technology, to really have access to billions of consumers. Another example in a very different sector is dog food. This example is a small business in New Brunswick. They have been selling dog food for a long time in a very traditional way. They have a distributor in Canada and the US, and they are selling through stores. 5 years ago, they put together a website to inform their client. They are not selling on their website, but to provide technical information about their product. They started to receive phone calls from different parts of the world. They wanted to distribute their dog food in Russia, in China, in Mexico. 5 years later, today they are selling in 28 different countries. Their biggest market outside North America is Mexico, Russia, and China. Because again, a small company, just with a website, their products have been visible now to the rest of the world. And now they are selling in 28 different countries. Finally, the last example is closer is right in British Columbia. This company called Noel Asmar Uniform. Noel Asmar, actually, she started a company about 12 years ago. She realized, I don't know when you go to a spa, but she realized that spa uniforms were not very well designed. So she designed and produced spa uniforms. And she didn't have a lot of money, or she didn't want to spend a lot of money on distribution, so she decided to sell only online. Her first sell was to the US. So that's very interesting. She already started to export right away. Her first order came from the US. 12 years later, she's selling all around the world. She has 8,000 Yes, 8,000 products on her website, and she's selling all over the world. She never sold in a store. She always did it on her website. So this digital technology is really changing the game for small business, and it allowed them to be visible to billions of people. That's a great way to start exporting. And like I said in conclusion, the world economy is really improving, and this is especially the case in the US. And this growth is going to be sustained for a few years. So this is a great timing to think about a growth strategy for your business. And we believe that export is one of the great strategies to help your business to grow. With new technology, with the online technology, now it's possible to do it for every size of business, even for smaller businesses. So thank you, and we'll be pleased to take questions with Todd over there. Thanks.
In the middle. In the middle. Well, ladies and gentlemen, reminder to fill out your question cards here, and a member of the chamber staff will come around and collect that. But we'll kick it off with a couple things here. You know, Todd, you're the eternal optimist, and sort of reminds me of that little joke. You know, the optimist and the pessimist are talking, and the pessimist says, "Well, I guess it can't get any worse." And the optimist says, "Well, of course it can." So I know you're not one of those kinds of optimists, so that's good. Maybe I want to pose, you know, Pierre, you spoke a lot about this is time is ripe for export activity. But you've got a lot of small businesses in the room. You spoke about the importance of a digital presence. But you know, what pieces of advice would you give? Todd, you spoke about the pragmatic, be realistic, don't fear, don't worry. But what are some of those things that you think companies can do in light of the economic environment that falls in that category of pragmatic, realistic, trying to keep their business on the right track in a slow period?
You want to start with me, or
either one of you? I mean,
well, I think you know, I think Todd is right. I think you have to be pragmatic. I agree that the Alberta economy is going to slow down this year, and how much is going to depend how long the price is going to be depressed. But I think the Alberta economy is much more diversified and solid than in the past. So I think this period of slowing down is not going to be as bad as what we have seen, you know, in the past. And a good way to prevent this is to look at other markets. Other part of Canada is going to grow. The lower dollar, the growth in the U.S. is going to stimulate the Ontario economy, for example. So that's a huge market that we can look at as a business. And also, the U.S. market is going to do very well for the next few years. So has a good strategy. I think it's time to explore other markets.
And what I would add, I think it's a golden opportunity in 2015 to do something that a lot of companies in busy times say, we don't have time to do this, and that is training of workers. Because that is the #1 complaint that a lot of companies have. It's like, we don't have any time to send our workers off on well-needed training, introduction of new systems, new innovations, new technologies. All of these things actually take a little bit of time to integrate into the company. And when you're running at full out, like we were in January of 2014, it's really difficult to tell companies, you need to send your workers for a week of training. Yeah, well, when? They're already working overtime. Now is the time to do it. And I understand that it seems counterintuitive, especially when cash flow is going to be weaker. Now we are going to send, you know, and pay for training. But if you don't do it in the downtimes, when are you ever going to do it?
I totally agree. You know, particularly what we're hearing a lot of companies saying, I just don't want to let go of my top staff, because if I do, I risk not getting them back when things swing up. The struggle is, do we have the budget to put people through training? I had a question here. A couple of them have built on this, so I'm going to ask this in a very round, general sense, but it kind of drives to a lot of the pieces that are being asked in the questions here. You know, we have a province that cyclical based on the nature of oil prices, You know, the Premier spoke about reductions in spending, getting the fiscal house in order there. But then at the end of the day, we still don't, even as much as we cut spending, we still don't want to be on this roller coaster forever. So, you know, my perspective would suggest we actually have a revenue we do have, in some ways, a spending problem in Alberta. We also have a revenue problem. What do you see as some of the solutions for Alberta? We know that, you know, the Premier has said there's no sales tax. I believe that all options should be on the table for consideration. You know, there are questions about what kinds of things should we look at. Should we be looking at royalties? Should we be looking at different changes to the income tax structure, both personal, corporate, sales taxes? What are your thoughts? I mean, obviously from a pure economic standpoint for Alberta.
Well, I think in terms of the government revenue, I'm not too worried. The government of Alberta is in a very good position. The debt level is very low, so they can afford to have lower revenue for a while. As for a long-term strategy, what I would suggest is to put a lot of energy on to diversify the economy. And I've seen already a lot of manufacturing companies who were built around the oil sector, and now they are exporting around the world. That's exactly what you need to promote. That's what you have to support, the development and the export of these companies. And that's how you will stabilize the economy in the long run. But Alberta, I think, has been really good to create those companies who are now selling, they are exporting their knowledge that they have been built here to the rest of the world. And I think that's really where you should diversify the economy.
Todd, any thoughts?
Well, it's we're sort of wading into political realms here, and I always have to be a little bit careful.
That's right, yes.
Yeah. But I think Albertans should consider the possibility, or maybe now is a good time. I know a sales tax isn't going to be on the table for anybody, but maybe the introduction of a BC-style gasoline tax. With gas prices, you know, in Edmonton, they're at 72 cents and 79 cents here. Now is the time to do this. If you're ever going to introduce a little bit of a gasoline tax, for the sake of, you know, look, folks, we need some revenue here. We don't want to start closing hospitals and schools, and we need to keep construction on our infrastructure projects going. Now is, I think, the time to ask Albertans, you know, with gas prices low, will we be able to manage a couple more cents a liter in order to provide some of that stable revenue?
Yeah, you look at the demographic of Alberta and the number of people who have moved into Alberta over the past while, all of us very likely having experienced environments of other kinds of retail taxes and things like that. There's probably more of an appetite now, in light of what you said. We don't want to be closing a lot of the essential services, cutting back in key spending areas. Switching to the housing market, what are your thoughts on the housing sector this year in Calgary and Alberta? Is it going to be as active? Do you see prices? Where do you see prices going from a resale perspective, or even a new purchase perspective? Labor needs associated with that sector. Maybe I'll start with you, Todd.
Well, I think the good news is, here I'm being the optimist again. The good news is we are going into a downturn. The residential market is in a very balanced position. Had we been going into this downturn with Toronto prices for condos or something that clearly isn't quite a balanced market, I'd be more worried. But we are going into this. The residential market in Calgary and throughout the province is actually pretty balanced, and it's been in a balanced position for about the last 2 or 3 years. So we're going into a downturn. I do think we will see some nervousness, some price wobbling, especially in the first half of the year. But our expectation is that when oil prices bottom out and start to climb back up, this will, level heads will prevail. And I think we'll end the year probably with even prices. I'm not expecting a decline. And in fact, in Edmonton, the Edmonton Real Estate Association is expecting a little bit of an increase, 3.5% increase in housing prices. Calgary, we might be hit disproportionately harder by the downturn in the energy sector. So, but I'd say, flat a year. Certainly not much of a growth year, but I'm not expecting any kind of implosion on the real estate market.
Right. Pierre, anything?
Well, I agree. I think it will take a longer time. I think if the price stay depressed for 2 or 3 years, and I don't expect that. You will see a decline in the housing market, but in the short term, like for the next 12 months, I don't think the economy. I think the economy will be strong enough to maintain the price and the housing activity.
Great. A question from the audience here asking: do you still think there's an Alberta advantage, the quote unquote the low tax environment, the good conditions for business in 2015? Is Alberta still a place where you think companies would want to locate as a sound business location?
Well, I think so, and I don't think it has actually as much to do with taxes as I do think it has to do with the attitude of people in Alberta. You know, I travel around other parts of the country, and it is palpable, the difference in attitude in this province. The people who have moved here, for one thing, are kind of naturally the go-getters anyway. They're the ones who have moved from provinces or countries or where there are less opportunities, and they're seizing opportunities here. Generally, they're optimistic, open-minded people ready to work hard. That, I think, is Alberta's biggest advantage. Tax advantage, you know, taxes, if you're just going to compete with the lowest tax jurisdiction, you're eventually going to lose that game. But if you compete with a workforce that is highly educated and highly optimistic and hardworking, I think that's what gives Alberta the best advantage.
I agree. I don't think it's on the tax side. I think it's more the people. There's a lot of entrepreneurs in Alberta. Like I said, I've been very impressed with the fact a lot of businesses were born here around the oil sector, and they have created equipment, machinery that they sell around the world. I lived in Saudi Arabia before, and I never saw that before. Everything was bought from outside the country. But here in Alberta, people have been creative, and they have been entrepreneurs. And they have built a new, for example, the machinery equipment sector in Alberta has been booming over the last 10 years. So I think that's what create economic activities, and that's why Alberta is still a very special place.
Great. Moving to the labor market, you know, Todd, you spoke about one of the silver linings of this is some of the decreasing cost pressures on our economy. But Canada is a higher labor cost environment. Wages are typically fairly sticky. You know, people don't like to see erosion of their income. What's your outlook for wages in 2015? Do you see, you know, people willing to take a bit of a pay cut to stay employed, or are we not that far down the road at this time, or do you see wages sort of holding flat? Obviously, we're probably not going to experience a lot of inflation this year, which would drive any kind of cost of living adjustments. Yeah. But what do you see on the wage?
I'll
start with Pierre.
Yeah. Well, I think it's more. I don't think the wage will decrease, but I agree with what was said before. I think in Alberta we have to find a way to reduce production costs, because I think the oil price is slowing down and is going to come back. But I'm not sure if it's going to come back at the same level that we have seen, for example, around $100 a barrel. It might come back, like Todd said, around $75. There's a new reality out there. There's more supply on the market. So to be successful in the future, we will have to revisit our cost of production. And there was a lot of research showing just before the price went down that costs were getting pretty high in Canada for producing oil. So I think that's where the work will have to be done to be able to be competitive in the future.
I think in Alberta, and maybe Calgary particularly, where we will see some adjustment on the wage side isn't in the base salary, but it'll be in the overtime, and it'll be in the bonus structure. Because you don't need to be laid off to have your bonus kind of wiped out. Or if you're working, say, construction or manufacturing where it's more hourly, even if you're not laid off, your overtime hours are likely to be scaled back. That is automatic savings for the payroll of those companies. So it doesn't even really need to take massive unemployment for people to come back and ask, you know, for a job that pays far less. I think we will see wages and cost pressures for these companies on their payroll automatically scale back as overtime hours decrease and as bonuses decrease.
Great. Well, I'm seeing people begin to make their way out, so I think we're going to wrap it there. So focus on exports, build your digital presence. Don't worry, be happy.
Don't worry. Be prudent, but don't worry too much.
Be happy, yeah, exactly. Ladies and gentlemen, Pierre and Todd, Please join me. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.